Hello there, a massive warm welcome back to the Health and Safety Digest, a special podcast by Astutis. As ever, I am your guide through this voyage of health, safety and environmental training, the digital content writer at Astutis, Toby Howell, and we're jumping straight back in this week to our chat with Managing Director of Astutis, Steve Terry, who's graciously given up his time to talk the most intricate details of health and safety training and the future of health and safety training. We'll be talking to him for the final time this week, but fear not, we'll be back very, very soon with even more chats with more influential people in the health, safety and environmental industries. So without further ado, let's jump straight back into our chat with Steve. This is a question that I like to ask everyone we have on the show because it is one of those subjective ones again. But for you personally, what would you say the most rewarding aspect of being of playing a part in the health, safety and environmental industry is for you?
I think it's client success stories. I think it's not just sort of necessarily individuals, individuals achieving their diploma, super impressive, super important. But when we feel like an in-company behavioural change, organisations have seen behavioural change because of the training we've done, be it online, virtual classroom, whatever, anything we've done to initiate behavioural change that ultimately will save lives or protect the planet. For me, that's the most rewarding part of being in the HSE industry.
I have to agree. I've been lucky enough to talk directly with a number of our successful learners who've been able to tell me personally on a one-to-one basis how that accreditation has been able to positively influence their lives, not only for their livelihood, but for their career, personal progression, how they feel about themselves. So I completely agree. And I just hope that we can hear more and more of these success stories as time goes on, because they're delight to hear. Let me move on to well-being. You touched on it earlier on. Now, as we've discussed on the show, the industry has changed in the last few years, with more and more awareness being brought onto the mental health side of health and safety, the well-being aspect of it. And we had Jason Anker on the show a few months ago, and he was touching on it rather prevalently. How important is it for you personally that well-being and mental health is given the same kind of attention as, say, the more practical elements of health and safety?
I think it's really important, and again, thinking in terms of the demographic that are coming through. I've got two kids, teenage, late teens, and the pressure that I think they're put on because of social media, just being on Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook. They probably don't use Facebook, but those sorts of online, those online sites. I think the pressure that puts, because everyone's in the spotlight, and I think that can have an impact on mental health. Knowing what other people are doing that you're not doing, feeling shortchanged about the fact that someone else has achieved this and you haven't, etc. So information now is so readily available on everybody, and I think that adds a pressure to younger people, and I think we've got to recognize that, as an industry. So I'd even move away. I think traditional mental health issues are super important and have to be addressed. And I think that's something that we do address in some of our courses, but not all of them. And I think there's probably some syllabus recommendations that we could be making there. But I think for the younger demographic that are coming through into industry, that will start to work in industry, they've always been on the other side of a screen, and I think that brings with it added pressures. And I think we need to be considering that as we move forward. So yeah, look, mental health, I think, there's a degree of multifaceted issues with mental health, and I think they're all relevant, but in different phases of different people's careers, if that makes sense. So for that reason, I think it's very, very important. It's incredibly important that it's in there, because it's certainly an issue, an issue for the employer, and we notice, and we ourselves, put a lot of emphasis on staff well-being, and ensuring that everybody's okay and everyone's got somewhere to go for a chat, and an open door policy scenario. As are most of our customers, but I think it's going to become even more complex, and I think we have to recognise that, and for that reason, it may even be more than a module. It could be a couple of modules, because I think there's a lot that we need to sort of learn from, and COVID has given us a good springboard for that, and I just like to think that will definitely be a lot more prevalent in the content that the accrediting bodies are sort of using to get that sort of to get to within their qualifications looking forward.
I completely agree, and the reason I felt the need to ask was because, as I mentioned, we had Jason Anker MBE on the show a few months ago, and he was very, very passionate about how he believes a employee with a good standard of mental health, of mental well-being, is much more likely to care about effective health and safety whilst on the job, and it makes complete sense. So I completely agree, and I'm delighted to hear what you said there. And of course, the company Astutis is doing all those things that you said, and it's fantastic. It's fantastic. I have one final question, and you are free, Steve, to enjoy your day-to-day activities that you were discussing at the start of the podcast. My final question for you today, Stephen, thank you for being such a generous interviewee. We've discussed about the mental health side and the practical side of health and safety, but the one thing we haven't touched on thus far is the environmental side. And right now, in my belief, it's one of the most important topics being discussed right now. In the last year, Astutis have introduced several training courses which are solely focused on environmental health and safety. How important is it that awareness around environmental issues continues to be as prevalent as it is today?
I mean, I think it's critical. The environment. A lot of organisations that we work with are working towards target net zero. They're working hard to ensure that their sort of sustainability credentials are correct, and I think that's 100% right. When we talked, you asked me a question earlier about the impact of the pandemic, and I would say the pandemic, for me personally, the pandemic had a massive impact on my thoughts around environment sustainability. We can all remember when there were no planes in the sky and there were no cars whirring by, and everybody's working from home. Everybody's sort of got a bit more of a wholesome life, I think. And I can just remember how how prevalent nature was then. The bird song, you could hear the birds. You could hear the birds. If you could hear the birds a lot clearer then than you can now. And similarly, everything just felt different from an environmental point of view. The place, the place seemed different now, and for the better, absolutely for the better. And I just, and that's a small sort of anecdote, but I think, we're never going to ground the planes again. I hope, we're never going to stop people traveling around in cars. But I think, we've kind of got to find a way to get back to that place by being creative and by not making unnecessary journeys, and trying our best to sort of be a bit more sustainable in our choices. And so for me, I think the environmental courses that we deliver have been a huge success. We've been delivering IEMA courses since we started as well, or maybe 1 year into when we started. But the Carbon Net Zero course we've recently launched, the IEMA Foundation course, the IEMA Sustainability sustainability suite of courses have been hugely popular, and that's really encouraging, because we're not just seeing individuals that are interested. We're seeing we're seeing senior managers jumping on these courses because they feel, what can we do to make a difference, and how can we use this back in our workplace? Can we educate? Because it's all about dial turns. There's not going to be one big sort of one big lockdown to make a difference forever. It's got to be a series of dial turns. So for me, I think it's immensely important. I think lockdown reinforced its importance to me, and since then, we've made it a priority to bring new environmental courses into the suite of courses, into the product mix, and they've been well received. So I think there's a real I think we can really kick on from here, and certainly the feedback I'm getting from the clients I speak to and our sales team, marketing team speak to, the feedback is is genuinely very positive. That's what they're doing. That's how they're approaching it. So, reasonable indicators. Hopefully, it'll be enough.
Well, I can speak firsthand, Steve. As you know, I am currently going towards the exam stage of the IEMA Foundation certificate
Well done.
in environmental management, and I'm enjoying it. It's blown my mind. It's introduced me to concepts I never thought were possible, Steve. But my fingers are crossed for the exam, and who knows, maybe it's the pathways to net zero next. But I just want to say a massive thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for sitting down and being a willing victim in this interrogation. And thank you for kind of letting us see underneath the hood in the business, and also, as we talked about, the environmental side, the well-being side, and the more practical sides of health and safety. Thank you very, very much.
That's a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, Toby.
I would like to extend a huge, gracious thank you to Steve for giving up his time over the past couple of weeks and joining us on the show. I have really enjoyed understanding his viewpoint a lot more regarding the health, safety and environmental industries, and I hope you, our listeners, have enjoyed it too. Moving on to our next couple of episodes, we are going to be hearing from our learners, and we're going to be showcasing their stories, how the training has allowed their careers to blossom, and more importantly, how they've used that training to be an influential factor in their fields, health, safety and environmental industries. So we cannot wait to hear more from you. Until then, please, if you have a question, you know what to do. Email me directly at toby.howell@astutis.com, and we will get your questions and answers heard on the show. You can follow us on our socials. Just type in Astutis and you will find us. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and as ever, stay safe.